everybody, Mr. Hartman here again, back with some EP World History. This time we're going to cover Unit 7.7, which is all about conducting World War II, basically how it played out. Let's get into it, starting with Japan and its imperialist politics. Can we shrink anything here? Let me zoom out a little bit. All right. So we've talked previously, or you've read previously, about the Mukden incident and the Manchu Kuo state, the puppet state set up in Manchuria. This shows that Japan is pretty secured on getting their own empire going. And in fact, they wanted to create what they called the New Order in East Asia. They wanted to create basically a East Asian empire, Southeast Asian empire for Japan. For example, they even wanted Siberia, but they couldn't do that anymore because their ally Germany was now in a non-aggression pact with the Soviets, which meant that so too was Japan. Next, they wanted a lot of expansion in Southeast Asia, but the problem for them was that Southeast Asia was under the control of imperial powers. So what if it wasn't? What if it was open and then available to Japan to take over? There are some issues here facing Japan, mostly the economic sanctions by the United States being one of their major economic partners. We have due to the occupation of China, U.S. sanctioned Japan, specifically preventing oil and scrap iron from getting to Japan, which really hurts their economy and their military. And so this leads to Japan deciding that retaliation is the best idea against the United States, hoping that kind of taking out the Pacific fleets of an isolationist America would lead to that country engaging in, coming to peace talks, right? Not necessarily interested in fighting the war. Turns out they were very wrong, but that's for a little bit later. So Germany early on, very successful early on with the Blitzkrieg lightning war tactics, basically kind of throwing their tanks out as fast as they could and their soldiers running in behind. I'm not sure about the entire tactics, but just know that it's super fast. That's the point of it. And it just is, people are unable to deal with it early on when they don't know how it works. And so they defeat Poland in less than a month, allows them to take over Poland along with the Soviet Union because they agreed to split it up. The early success then leads to even more success with Denmark and Norway, and then Netherlands, Belgium, and France. France taken, once they started to invade France, it took them less than a month. And this brought the conquered nations under political and economic control, allowed them to take over northern France under the Vichy regime, under the World War I general Marshal Pétain. All right, so now let's go and talk about Britain and Germany. So, hey, within the span of a few months, Germany's taken over essentially all of continental Western Europe. And so Britain's pretty much the only ones left to fight the Germans in Europe at this point. Because, again, they have that non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union at this time, although it turns out, as we'll see in a little bit, it's kind of a ploy a little bit by the Germans. So the British asked the United States for support, mostly because the British were very fearful that they were next up on the chopping block for Germany, which was correct. And despite history of Americans not interfering in European wars, FDR decides to help the British out in two different actions. The Destroyers for Bases Agreement, where the Americans sent 50 American destroyers to the British in exchange for the lease on 8 naval bases in the Western Hemisphere for America, from the British. The second one, though, probably more famous, the Lend-Lease Act, which basically the U.S. lends war materials to Britain and in exchange gets more bases, I believe, on that. But this really, since this is direct war material selling to them, this ends any concept of neutrality for the Americans, but they're still not participating in the war. What we do see Britain in America focus on is kind of trying to figure out what the post-war world would look like before the war is over, which is, maybe a little assumptive, but, presumptive, I should say. And they do this in what's called the Atlantic Charter, which outlined the goals of the post-war world, advocated for self-government, also known as self-determination, denial of the use of force as a kind of political tool, and then the disarmament of aggressive nations. But while this is happening, or before this is happening, I believe, we have the Battle of Britain, where Hitler begins invading Britain, or tries to begin the planned invasion of Britain by bombing major bases. However, over time, this doesn't seem to be super successful because the British are still doing what they want to do, and so they start targeting civilians, specifically in London. This is kind of known as Britain's finest hour because what you see is the British people kind of just go about their day despite the bombing. They're not super fazed by it. And this actually is a really this backfires a lot on Hitler because moving away from their targeting of military bases allows for the British to rebuild those military bases, right? And so Britain is very successful in defeating the Luftwaffe, especially after kind of some early on troubles, but mostly due to the development of radar. This is the first successful use of radar in military, or at least in Air Force combat. And so their ability to do that, as well as their growing skills in flying, and then also their slightly superior planes. It's not like their planes are like a million times better. But the problem became the Germans were losing more planes than they could produce every given day, and so they eventually had to scupper their attempted invasion of Britain. So Britain successfully defends themselves. This should probably turn into something about the Soviets, because as we'll see in a little bit, the Germans are going to turn on the Soviets here in a second. But let's go back over to Japan. After successfully taking over many Pacific islands for their own purposes in terms of supply and protection, and especially because they were planning this, right? They were planning Pearl Harbor, so they wanted to take over all the islands so that it would make it a lot harder for the Americans to take islands to go attack Japan. They attacked Pearl Harbor. They attempted to destroy much of the U.S., all of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and they did get quite a bit of it, but they missed the key components, the aircraft carriers. The aircraft carriers are really going to define World War II in the Pacific more than anything. And they were out to sea on some sort of exercise. I don't even think they were necessarily doing anything big. And so once they did this, they seized the Philippines from America, the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, Burma, and a lot of other Pacific islands. Again, they thought that because America was so determined to be isolationist, that the Americans would just settle with the Japanese and allow them to take over Southeast Asia. But like turning a light switch on, the Americans all of a sudden were not isolationists at all because of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Right, this is the first time the Americans have really seen, their land attacked. Right, the 50 states, the United States of America, was physically attacked by another nation, and we did see in World War I the sinking of Lusitania kind of lead to some similar actions. But again, that was a boat. And even that didn't directly lead them into war, right? There was other things that occurred as well. So Great Britain and China joined the United States in the war against Japan, and then Hitler goes ahead and declares war on the United States, bringing the United States into both fronts. We then also see some colonies start to get into the war, especially India. 2.5 million soldiers from India, mostly to go fight the Japanese in Southeast Asia. You think that'd be enough because Japan's one of Japan's biggest weaknesses is their lack of population compared to others. But it'll get there. Home fronts, same kind of stuff as World War I with the utilization of the total war. The key thing here that we saw a little bit in World War I, but not nearly to the levels of this, is that the United States was already producing pretty well factory-wise, and now that they're all focused on warfare, building munitions and whatnot, and the government's helping organize all that, the American economy takes off. It goes supersonic in terms of its growth. This is the number one time period of American economic growth, which is both a good and a bad thing. Right? Good thing is economic growth. The bad thing is that a lot of people kind of expect this to be the norm even today. And it's simply not, right? It will never be unless we, create some sort of military economy, which is terrifying. But hey, women, once again, just like in World War I, are available to produce in the workforce, go to the factories, cover the factories for the men, cover the farms for the men who are off to battle. And so, in fact, you see the American government launch a propaganda campaign around this, around Rosie the Riveter, about strong women participating in the workforce. To help out the country, right? I'm doing my part, I believe, or something like that. Germany, on the other hand, relied on their forced labor from the countries they captured. Sometimes that forced labor was even in concentration camps, and 20% of the wartime workforce of Germany was forced labor, which is a big problem because that was an incredibly unproductive segment of their labor because they were in they were forced labor, so they weren't necessarily planning on working that hard. Japan, on the other side, Japan tried to, for the public at home, try to keep on this veneer, this falsity of everything's fine, continue throughout your day. And so they did not have women participating in the economy like we see in the United States, which is going to be a really, really, really bad call. It's going to really decrease the Japanese ability to produce on the level with the Americans over time. They did move children to rural areas, which we see in Britain as well, quite successfully, possibly Germany, I really don't know. And they were able to ration food, mostly because their rice production is very strong, and rice is, caloric density is so high. In the European front, European theater, U.S. enters the war in December of 1941 and allies with the British and the Soviet Union. As they start the Americans first make their European appearance actually in North Africa, which is considered part of the European theater, but that's weird, neither here nor there. And when the Americans get there, the Allies are struggling against the Germans, specifically against Erwin Rommel, the German general of the tanks, known as the Desert Fox. And so they were very successful in North Africa until the British turned the tide at the Battle of El Alamein, and then start to push the Germans out of North Africa and back into Italy. Meanwhile, on the other side of the European theater, which they didn't mention this, unless I missed it in my notes somewhere, but the Germans launched a surprise counterattack on the Soviets, who they were just in a non-aggression pact with. The reason, maybe it was up here. Did I miss something? No? Okay. The Soviet Union, so the Germans, the reason they had this alliance with the Soviets in the first place was to prevent a two-front war. And now they've successfully done that because they defeated France, right? They defeated all of Western Europe except for Britain, and Britain's not going to, make an amphibious assault by themselves. That'd be suicide for them, right? And so they decide to go start attacking the Soviets and successfully push all the way into places like Stalingrad. But after, I forget how long it is. It's like a 6-month, 9-month siege of Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army is defeated by the Soviets. That is a brutal, brutal battle. If you want to learn more about that, go look that up. And so at this point, we're seeing momentum really start to swing for the Allies in the European fronts. In the Pacific theater, we got some pretty key things going on in 1942. The Battle of Coral Sea is the first Allied victory in the Pacific, which prevents the Japanese invasion of Australia. We see the destruction of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers at the Battle of Midway in June, which pretty much stops the advance dead in its tracks, and they have to start. And now all of a sudden we see the Americans on the offensive, which starts in early 1943 at the Battle of Guadalcanal, another pretty brutal battle. And so the island hopping strategies, which utilized in the Pacific theater, basically just targeting the weakest islands held by Japan and then ignoring the others because Japan's not really going to be able to do anything from those islands. And then at the same time, we also have them kind of pushing their way up north through the Philippines very slowly, very dangerously. The Philippines is a very rough point, a rough location during the war, including things like the Bataan Death March of the Allied forces. But them being able to get to the northern portion of the Philippines allows them to maybe start thinking about launching bombing raids on Japan. I think they have to get a little bit closer, if I recall, but that does help quite a bit. Role of technology in Allied victory. Aircraft carriers in the Pacific are that's the reason they win. That is it. There's nothing else to say about it. Their aircraft carriers and the sheer amount of aircraft carriers, right? Japan has aircraft carriers themselves. But the sheer amount that the Americans are able to produce allows for the Navy to really extend its zone of power, right? Because these aircraft carriers are essentially, are floating islands in terms of their ability to house planes, right? So that's a huge deal. And then also the submarines in the Pacific really ruin the Japanese supply lines, which already was kind of like the thing that was going to end up hurting the Japanese, and now it's going to hurt them even worse, right? So as we get into 1943 in the European theater, we see the Allied invasion of Italy, which is the weak underbelly of Fortress Europa, as they call it at this point. Allies pretty quickly gained control of Sicily in 1943, which almost pretty quickly thereafter leads to the fall of Mussolini. They then invade southern Italy, and by June of 1944, in fact, a few days before D-Day, they take Rome, pretty much ending Italian resistance against them, if not already having done so. June 6th, 1944, pretty crucial day. It's D-Day, right? That's the landing at in Normandy. You got Omaha, Utah, Gold Beach. There's some other ones where it's a mix of American, British, and the Anzac troops, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. Mostly Canada, I think, at this point. But again, I could be wrong. I don't know. So they literally have to force an amphibious assault and invasion of Europe on the French beaches of Normandy. Very bloody, very, very bad set of circumstances, but they were able to create a beachhead and basically create a location from which to launch a full-scale invasion of Germany. And they start pushing into Paris. They successfully take over Paris in August. And so now they're able to kind of create a whole front against the Germans and push them back. The Germans do make one last push at the Battle of the Bulge, which is basically on the map of the two forces. There was a little bulge in the Ardennes forest where the Germans were trying to break through. They're unsuccessful. If you want to watch a very good show that kind of shows some of the insanity of this all, Band of Brothers focuses on the Battle of the Bulge for the last 2 or 3 episodes or so. Mostly focusing on the Ardennes forest, which is a huge forest between Belgium, Netherlands, and northern France. The Germans lose, basically ends the war for them. And then what we start to see, the Allies start to systematically destroy all German factory work, basically preventing them from resupplying themselves via air raids. The Soviets are also moving towards Germany, especially after the famous tank battle at Kursk, which ends in Soviet victory. And that is really the big. That's where they're pushing in. It seems pretty inevitable at this point, and basically arrive in Berlin at the same time as the Allies. Meanwhile, Hitler bunkers up, recognizes what's going on. He commits suicide on April 30th, 1945, which is just 2 days after Mussolini is murdered. Maybe they're connected. And then after his death, Germany, the high command surrenders. And May 8th, 1945 is VE Day, or Victory in Europe. And then Japan takes a little bit longer. The U.S. capture Okinawa and Iwo Jima off the coast of Japan, which allows them to launch air raids into Japan, including the firebombing of Tokyo, which is a very, very bad event. But the Japanese refuse to surrender. Part of the mentality of the Japanese at this point is to never surrender, even in the battles, right? Which makes fighting the Japanese very, very tough because they will not surrender. And so what we see is that using some sort of calculus, Truman decides that this is going to save more American lives to drop a nuclear bomb on Japan than invading it. And so they drop an atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6th, 1945. The Japanese government doesn't do anything because they think that's all they got. It's not all they got. They have one more. They have one more nuclear bomb, and they dropped that 3 days later on Nagasaki, leading to 140,000 Japanese civilians dying. And then after the second one, with the premise here being that they have more, right? They have an infinite amount. Japan surrenders unconditionally on August 14th, and then September 2nd is Victory in Japan Day. A lot of little side note, but there's a big theory that one of the major reasons Truman did this to begin with is to kind of scare off the Soviets because the Cold War was clearly coming for all of them. So, so bloodiest war in human history: 75 million people died, with 50 million of those being civilians. Incredibly brutal, bloody war. It changed how people thought about racism, colonialism, and international relations going forward. You're going to see World War II. The effects of World War II are a lot of the promises of the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles, the Paris Peace Conference of World War I, where they promise the things in these 14 points, but they don't follow through. World War II kind of leads to that follow through in a lot of ways. Not every way, but in a lot of ways. But we are going to see an ideological battle between the Soviets and the United States during the Cold War because of World War II. And that's it for 7.7. Thank you guys so much for watching. See you in the next one.